Welcome here. It's time for the session that you see on the screen, which has a very, very long title that I'm going to spare myself and you from reading it. But first we're going to hear from Professor Andrew McStay. He's going to give a short presentation on some of the aspects of emotional AI, after which we're going to have a couple of questions just to start us off. And you are absolutely invited at any point to raise a hand, wave, or do any other signal which is going to be explicit enough for me to notice you. And I want you to join the conversation immediately. If I don't have to give the first question, that might not even be such a bad situation. But please, Mr. Professor, take us away.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think just to echo Philip, can you hear me at the back? Okay, I need the microphone apparently. So if you do have any questions, do just kind of raise a hand or just fire a question out straight away. Don't wait until the presentation has ended. So we'll try and keep this as kind of loose and as dynamic as possible. So this is the title of the presentation, Emotional AI, the Automation of Consumer Psychology. I guess there's a few things I want to do in this little talk. I want to talk a little bit about the background of some of these technologies, where they've come from, and really kind of to make the point that these technologies and these approaches are not that new. So, sometimes when we kind of get into kind of questions of kind of AI and technology, it all gets a little bit kind of gee whiz. And I really like to kind of look a little bit backwards so we can really kind of understand where we are today. But the presentation is going to focus on kind of advertising and kind of the retail space. So lots of other areas we could get into, and if we want to get into that as we in the kind of question and answer session, we could explore other dimensions, but we're going to focus on advertising. Let's just kick off and see where we get to. So some definitions to begin with. So in terms of when we think about what emotional AI is, essentially, it's a kind of a mixture of affective computing. So affective computing essentially measures the body. It measures kind of emotional behavior of the body. So that's things such as kind of respiration, things such as facial expressions, and so on and so forth. And it makes use of what's called weak AI. So strong AI is this idea, is the belief that machines are somehow able to think. It's that idea that kind of came with AI as it got in the kind of 1950s onwards. Weak AI is a little bit different. It kind of assumes that machines don't really think. They can't think. It tends to be a bit more kind of task specific. Consumer psychology, I'm sure you know what consumer psychology is, but just to kind of offer you kind of a working definition on the screen, it's essentially about kind of understanding kind of the why and how of consumer activities and how people are affected by these things. So in terms of the study itself, the background context is that I did around 100 interviews around the world. So that's in the UK, that's across Europe, unfortunately not in Slovenia, but across many other countries within Europe, also the US, but also in the Middle East as well. So I think that's kind of important that when you're thinking about these technologies and where these technologies are going, that you're not just thinking in a European context, and you're not just thinking in a US context. And sometimes that's a bit too easy to do. When we're thinking about the implications of these technologies, think also in terms of non-democratic states. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about kind of privacy issues, it's really important to remember that, other countries have different societal makeups. I did kind of a big UK survey, which I'll come on to in a bit, and I did a kind of whole bunch of workshops as well. But the broader point is that our technologies are showing signs of empathy. That's kind of a really strange idea. And that when we think about empathy, we normally think of it as a kind of quintessentially human idea, that we identify with somebody, that we can somehow feel what other people are feeling. My argument is kind of slightly different, that in that when we kind of talk about what empathy is, we're often reading people, we're reading signals, we're reading behavior. And it turns out that machines can be quite good at reading, at sensing, and at recording. So in terms of I'm kind of looking at kind of empathy from a kind of a computational angle, it's about sensing, it's about reading, it's about interpreting. Weirdly, and that's how people do empathy too. So in terms of looking backwards, I think it's quite important to note that when we think about the origins of consumer psychology, it's technological. Sometimes we think of psychology as something different, but the origins of consumer psychology, arguably the origins of psychology in and of itself, started around kind of the 1880s with in the labs of Wilhelm Wundt, and essentially what he was doing, he was using devices to track attention. He was measuring blood pulses. He was interested in physiological reactions to stimuli. And I find that really quite interesting. So that when we think about what emotional AI is, we think about these technologies, and we think of these somehow really new, it actually goes back to the origins of psychology itself. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. A second driver, if you like, of these types of technologies also goes kind of way back to the 1880s. So what you see here, you're seeing a guy called Duchenne, and essentially what he's doing, he's kind of tracking facial expressions. And what he's doing, he's using electrodes really new at that time, to track expression. So the guy himself is just pulling the expressions. He isn't actually feeling happy at that stage. But what he is doing is understanding and mapping the muscles used for facial expression. So this might kind of help make the point a little bit better. So in each of these, on each of these plates, if you like, this is kind of arguably kind of the most horrific. He's not actually in pain. He's simulating being in pain. He's simulating deep unhappiness. Here, he's simulating sadness. Here, he's simulating surprise, that one. But what Duchenne did is use these electrodes to map facial expressions. So in terms of when we kind of talk about kind of reading facial expressions in retail outlets, when we talk about reading facial expressions in advertising, all the things that we're going to talk about in a moment, this is kind of where it comes from. I think the other thing to notice here is the reliance on new technology. Photography was pretty recent in the 1880s, arguably invented kind of around the 1820s, 1840s. But this type of photography was a new medium. The use of electrodes, again, electricity in the 1880s was new media. So this kind of emphasis on new technologies to gauge emotions is not just technologically similar, but it's actually discursively similar, and that's kind of a reliance on new technologies to gauge emotions. You kind of see this stuff today. So the principle is similar. So instead we're using computer vision to kind of register kind of changes in the shape of the mouth, changes in shapes around the eyes, and kind of nose wrinkling. So all the kind of same principles that Duchenne was kind of using here, we're doing via computer vision instead. So in just a bit more background, and do tell me to speed if you need me to. The origin of the technologies that we're talking about today really kind of come from this person, Rosa Lynn. Interestingly, a woman looking at emotions in technology, which is kind of quite telling in and of itself. And it's interesting when you read her work for her to talk about her experiences of working at MIT, a very male-dominated space, talking about emotions. They all thought she was mad. I think she might have to end up having the final laugh with this stuff. But if you want to know more about this, this is her book. I think it was published in 95, 97, still really relevant today. Apologies for the horrible slide. I'll run through this pretty quickly. But what you see in front of you is a long list of different types of computer sensing that are used. So I've talked a little bit about faces, but I haven't talked about so much about voice, eye tracking, wearable devices that many of us wear, EEG, gesture, behavior, and so forth. So obviously you don't have to take notes or anything, but just to give you a sense of the different types of approaches that are used, i.e. sentiment, which is online, facial coding, which is faces, voice analytics, eye tracking, and a whole bunch of wearable devices. In terms of where these technologies are being used, in all sorts of different spaces, we'll talk a little bit about advertising in a moment, but these are the sectors in which emotional AI is being applied. And it'd be really interesting if we could explore some of these other areas as we get into the kind of more conversational element. But everything from the bedroom, sex tech, education, also huge. We've heard a little bit about home assistants and robots yesterday. And all these different areas are actively, not just tentatively, but actively exploring emotion capture techniques. So the broader point that I really want to kind of get to with that is that when we think about emotional AI, we're thinking about a net rise of interest in emotional life. So some practical examples might help. This is London, this is Oxford Street, and what you're looking at here is a lady stood waiting for a bus. The bus has just gone by, maybe because she was looking at the ad. But above the ad here, there's a little camera, a little Microsoft Kinect camera. So, very kind of relatively low-tech stuff. And in essence, what's happening is that the camera is looking at her facial expressions, and it's registering whether she's happy, neutral, or sad. And in essence, what the computer system is trying to do is trying to elicit more happy expressions than sad expressions. And the kind of interesting bit here is that the ad changes. The ad changes its creative elements so as to elicit more smiles over the course of a day. So in essence, what you have is two things. You have one, we're in a situation where it's not just us looking at ads, but they're looking at us back. I'm not talking about online behavioral advertising. We're talking public, civic, streets. But secondly, we have adverts that optimize themselves to elicit more smiles. That, for me, is a real landmark thing. This was 2015. For me, that's a sea change. And I don't think this has been noticed as much as it should have been. So this is Oxford Street, London. This is also London. What you're seeing here, this is Piccadilly Circus. So if you think kind of Times Square in New York, this is kind of London's version, where we kind of have a whole bunch of kind of ad screens around. And what you have also here is cameras watching not just one person, but watching every single passerby, trying to gauge emotional expressions, trying to gauge the reactions of people as they move through urban spaces. That's really significant, but they do what critically, and this is really quite important, it doesn't actually identify people. It collects data about expressions, but it doesn't identify them. As we'll come on to talk about in a moment, that's really significant. So this is also from London. This is from Wimbledon, the Wimbledon Tennis Festival. What they did there, they did something a little bit different. So they also used facial coding. They also collected data about facial expressions, but they were also interested in voices. They were interested in the highs and the ebbs and what people were saying in the Wimbledon Tennis Festival itself, trying to gauge the overall emotionality of the event. They also had, Mindshare was the advertising agency that did this. They also had people in there with wearables as well. So as kind of the match becomes more exciting, and UK might actually get a winner once, as kind of we're kind of playing for the final, playing for the match, heart rates go up, everybody's excited, or not, we might lose, as the case may be, as you have the expressions at the back, and maybe it's a near miss. But in terms of the idea of kind of using these technologies to kind of gauge events, this is kind of something that we're increasingly seeing too. So it's kind of interesting. I'll just come back for a bit. But yeah, so in terms of kind of the overall kind of situation that we're in a situation where kind of technologies are kind of detecting emotions, but it's not always identifiable. But I certainly think that from the point of view of that these technologies are being rolled out in our spaces. They've been rolled out in public spaces. So you might argue that online in kind of in a commercial space, then maybe. But in a public space, in a public civic space, that's a very different issue. But it's interesting, when you kind of look back at kind of the history of what's called psychogeography. Has anybody heard of this guy, Guy Debord? Yeah, oh yeah. Big fan. Okay, there's a few people. Well, Guy Debord, was actually quite interested in emotion tracking. He was kind of okay with this stuff. He was interested in kind of understanding more about kind of the emotions and behavior of individuals. And for the simple reason that he wanted to awaken the masses to the real conditions under which they live. And that's kind of really interesting, because if you kind of understand kind of the real experience of real citizens, then, kind of power holders are kind of forced to do something with this. And I find that quite interesting that some of the most critical writers are quite interested in the idea of kind of datafication and the recording of emotion. So I find that there's actually quite a delicious paradox in there, that people like Guy Debord are really quite interested in this stuff. Okay. But yeah, in terms of kind of UK reactions, you know, I asked UK citizens a bunch of questions, and this was kind of a full UK survey. It's quite a rigorous survey. It was around 2,000 people that I asked, and I asked them a whole range of questions, but this one's perhaps the most relevant. And it's about advertising agencies who developed ads that optimize themselves to work out our emotions towards the ad, and if you can read for yourself. So I asked them this question, and you know, I really wasn't quite sure how they would feel about this. This was with the potential answers that they could give. So one, that in terms of whether they're okay with kind of having their data collected, so one option was that they could say, I'm not okay with data about this being collected in any way, shape, or form. The other option was that they're okay with it as long as the data is anonymized. The third option was that, again, I'm okay, and okay to be linked with personal information. And then there was a don't know. So there was one, that I'm not okay in any way, shape, or form. Two, okay, as long as it's anonymized. Three, I'm okay to be linked with my personal data in terms of my mobile devices, in terms of my address, i.e. my real-life identity. Four, don't know. And this is kind of what was said. So this is the UK overall. Less than 50%, just under 50, said that not okay with it in any way, shape, or form. 33% of the UK population said they're okay with it as long as it doesn't identify them. Only 8% said that they're okay with kind of being linked with personal information, and 9% don't know. So I think the findings are kind of are pretty interesting there, and they may not be kind of conclusive, but I think there's certainly kind of no appetite for this within the UK. How are we doing for time?
You've got about 5 minutes left.
Okay, that's yeah, probably just enough. So this kind of raises questions, particularly on the point about whether the technologies identify people or not. We can have lots of discussion about emotion tracking. It's been a horrible thing. We might not want it, all that kind of stuff. But for me, the real democratic issue, the real democratic threat, the real problem that's kind of here right before us is that these technologies are being used in ways that people don't particularly like, but they're being used in our public spaces on citizens. And I think that's a privacy issue, and I think it's a policy issue. So I asked a range of law firms. I asked people at the European Commission. I asked a UK Queen's Council. It's essentially kind of one of the highest legal authorities in the UK. And yeah, a media technology firm. And they didn't have a unified answer on this, and I thought that was really interesting. So at the top, the really kind of very expensive law firm. I didn't pay for it, I should add. They just were okay with talking to me. But they said consent is always required, whatever the situation. But this is the most important one. This is from Director General Connect. This is the European Commission in Brussels. They said it doesn't require consent, again, if it doesn't identify. And I thought this was interesting, but others say it hinges upon whether a person is singled out, which echoes this one. But here, this was a really interesting one. This is really interesting. Interview. And they said privacy law has some flexibility. Apologies if your law isn't your thing. But if you kind of look at kind of the Article 8 of kind of European Convention on Human Rights, essentially it talks about privacy, and it talks about kind of protection of communication and that kind of thing, but it also talks about respect and dignity. And I find those words, respect and dignity, really important key words. So what his argument was is that there is scope for cases to be brought on the basis of respect and dignity. And given that we're talking about bodies here, respect, dignity, bodies, that's kind of what we're talking about here. So it's going to be interesting to see where all of this goes. And it's going to be case law that will decide it. Nobody's brought a case yet, but it'll be interesting to see what happens when somebody decides to do so. Cool. And the book.
Okay, thank you. Have a seat. So, anyone dying to ask a question immediately? No. Okay. So you spoke about the use of emotional artificial intelligence or emotional machine learning or machine intelligence in advertising. What are some of the other more interesting or equally interesting spaces where this is going to become a thing or already is a thing?
Yeah. You in your mind, you can map this. So you can map this. You could literally kind of start from getting out of bed in the morning. Some of you got to have sex toys in the bedroom, perhaps in the drawer by your bed. Lots of sex toys now have emotion tracking capacity. As you switch on your computer, you switch on your social media, there's emotion tracking there. And basically, we're kind of moving to a situation where all of our technologies are increasingly emotion capture enabled. So I think, as we kind of think about, as we move through kind of different kind of technologies, through kind of different spaces, I think that's the kind of it's down to this kind of net rise of interest. But some other interesting kind of case examples. Education would be one that I find particularly interesting. So certainly China they've kind of been rolling this out within the classroom, and educational authorities within the UK and the US are also interested in rolling out emotion classes in the classroom. So the idea is that kind of teacher stands at the front of the room. But we can't always gauge whether people are a little bit bored, distracted. Perhaps it's what time is it now? Perhaps it's 3:30. You've been kind of sat in a warm room all day. Perhaps kind of your interest levels are beginning to wane a little bit. As a teacher, we're kind of interested in kind of feedback in that kind of stuff. So the idea is that you kind of have a camera up above, which kind of tracks your expressions and your interest levels throughout the day. And it collects that data, and it uses that data. The question thereafter becomes, well, how long is that data stored for? Who gets to see that data? And a whole bunch of questions about whether the life chances of a person are impacted in some way by having this kind of data collected. So education, I think, is one big interesting area. Border control is another. So there's been European Commission-funded research projects which have been looking at voice analytics for some time to essentially test kind of emotions and truth. To see whether people are lying at national borders. These projects have now come to completion. They're now being rolled out on borders. Similar in the US as well. Department for Homeland Security, again, also interested in using these technologies. So there's kind of lots of kind of different areas where this stuff's being used.
But I would imagine the problem isn't just data collection or the existence of this technology or these technologies, but the question is in the power relations that are taking place when we're using these technologies. So for instance, even if we stick with the education example, you as a professor who wants to give their students the best possible experience might have an ethically clean way of using that information, but what happens when the university administration starts using that piece of information to control you or to guide your work and setting you performance reviews for, your students are always sad when they listen to you because you talk about depressing things. Your subject, you should probably change that. Should that be a concern for us, or do you believe that in these very specific cases, the people who might be subject to control or censorship through these technologies will be able to fight back effectively or oppose these types of measures?
Yeah, no, we should be concerned, for sure. There's no two ways about it. I think, part of that's kind of a classroom thing, in terms of, just as you say, kind of educators having curricula dictated to them. And, we see that to an extent we already kind of see that, certainly within UK universities. And I suspect kind of things might be a little bit different. I'll be interested to hear if not. But already within the UK, we kind of have to bundle our classes in such a way as to make them more appealing, to be better performers, possibly to kind of be talking about kind of more industry-friendly related stuff, rather than kind of hardcore critical theory. So we're already feeling a push in that direction in a way. But I think, we talked about advertising and retail. What I'd neglected to say at that point, of course, is not just kind of the people in the establishments who are being surveyed, but it's the workers as well. So what does it mean to kind of have, to be, not just to kind of have your kind of performance managed and kind of watched, just as you would expect any kind of human manager to do, but literally to have every single micro expression captured, segmented, analyze, and for somebody to make decisions on the basis of this stuff. And of course, this all assumes that the technology is any good. This all assumes that the technology does actually gauge emotions. But of course, what a person feels and kind of what a person might express can often be two different things. And emotional life doesn't fit into kind of happy, sad, angry, etc. It's far, far, far richer. All of this kind of works on the basis of there being the basic set of emotions. It's based on a particular psychological idea, which is kind of, for many, is kind of really discredited. What's absolutely for sure is that there's no universal agreement on what emotions are. Now, that might not matter so much if you're kind of in public space and you're looking at ads. You might say, who cares? You might have a much stronger reaction. But if you're talking about life decisions, for example, in relation to mental health, in relation to insurance, in relation to well-being, you're being judged on a faulty psychological model, and you're having kind of life decisions made about you on that basis. I found that slightly concerning.
Yeah, you talk about that in the book, the problem of how we are going towards, or we were presented with a set of universal emotions that we regularly have and that somehow all people exhibit in much the same way, but there's a lot of nuance that lacks in these situations. But assuming that at some point we find ourselves in the situation where this technology actually works, that somehow the algorithm, despite all of our mistakes, has figured out how to map emotions to certain outputs of a specific program. When does this become a problem in terms of the advertisers have always insulted us a little bit in order to sell us stuff, like you're not this enough, you're not that enough, at least implicitly. But what happens at the point where this can become highly personalized, when these insults can actually do much more lasting, immediate damage than we've seen from advertising or even pop culture that presented itself in the past 50 years? Is this something we should be afraid of? Is this something we should seek to regulate? Or is this something that is just going to happen and we're going to have to find monkey-wrenching ways to fight against this?
Yeah, that for me, that doesn't sound like, I'll come on to an issue that I have with that point in a moment, but I think when you look at kind of what advertising does, I think it's much more, historically the advertising industry is much more insidious in terms of kind of creating identities that people feel that they have to mold themselves into, or at least around, or have to negotiate. So even if you're going to reject something, you still have to accept the premise in the first place. You still have to struggle against that thing. And I think what the advertising industry has done, and the wider promotional culture industry, that for me is kind of far more insidious than dealing with a particular instance and moment. But what I do find, again, in terms of kind of speaking, I guess, kind of in relation to your point, yeah, this kind of, in terms of these technology, when we kind of see the woman kind of looking at the bus shelter at the end of Oxford Street, it's about whether she's happy or not. But, but thinking about whether we should be using emotion tracking technologies where you might kind of be walking through a shopping centre, you might have two children with you, you might not have slept, you're kind of a single parent, it's kind of possibly having a tough time. So the idea of kind of living through emotion tracking, having each micro expression captured, that just seems to me really intrusive. And it is a physical violation. And I think in terms of how we think about this, it is different from behavioral advertising. It's much more to do with our bodies. It's much more sensitive, and it's, as the title of the conference, it's much more intimate. And I think that's, it's quite important.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Some of our most intimate emotional moments are usually taken away from people, right? So there are situations where you have to fight your own body to step out of the room in order to be able to cry alone because that's what you want to do. Whereas sometimes people used to do that in public places. You could have an alone cry in a public park. What happens now when that becomes nearly impossible, at least in terms of what the government is concerned with? Does anyone have any questions? Okay, so yes.
I have a question. Okay. I have a question about this control of people on the border with some sort of emotional artificial intelligence technology. So if we think about how a basic lie detector machine works, it also measures it doesn't measure if you lie, it measures your bodily response, and then on the basis of this, they conclude if you lie or not. Mm-hmm. And this technology is not admissible in court. For example, a lie detector test, you cannot present it as evidence in court. Why then do we now have some kind of emotional artificial intelligence machines at airports, I think, in Hungary, in Greece, in Latvia, if I'm not mistaken? Why are they there? Who thought this was okay to put them there? And are they in any way different than just your basic old, well-known lie detector machine?
Yeah, they're different. One measures blood, the other measures voice. So the one kind of being kind of rolled out at points is based on voice rather than blood in terms of kind of blood flow, pressure, and reactions. But yeah, no, but the error rates are still there. These things can't be perfect. And I think in terms of why kind of lie detection, kind of why they're not used. Yeah, it's an error rate issue, but they're still pretty good. The technologies, I'm not speaking on defense of kind of those using these things, but they're not totally and utterly flawed. And so the reason why they're increasingly used at borders is because they are of some utility, they are of some usefulness. In terms of how they're being rolled out in an advisory capacity. So the machine doesn't get to make the final decision on whether you kind of enter or not, but simply you'll be flagged on the basis of your responses to that. So in terms of why they're being used, that's why. In terms of whether that's a good thing or not is kind of another question that kind of raises a whole set of other issues. But does that answer the question? I don't think it does.
No, because I don't understand. So what the premise is that this machine is going to determine better than a human if the person who is trying to come into a country is lying or not, or what?
But I think the answer, unfortunately, is yes. So in terms of the research was done on this. It has been tested. As to whether it totally fails is kind of another question altogether. But I think if we're going to critique the technologies and we want to do something about them, I don't think it's at least in this case, it's not necessarily on the basis of effectiveness. Of course, the question is kind of what kind of error rate are we willing to accept? There are lots of technologies in this area that are being used, facial recognition being the obvious one, where the error rates are really high. But on the voice side of things, the error rates are actually quite low. So there's lots of criticisms to be made, but I'm not sure that kind of accuracy is the one that I would go for. But I think there is an interesting question to be asked there about why was this funded in the first place? Is the European Commission public money? I hasten to say it's our money that's kind of paying for this stuff. But that's another question.
Would you mind passing the mic?
Okay, thanks. So when you said if law isn't your thing, law is my thing, so I'm going to have a legal question. I was just wondering, because you showed this example of the commercial screen in public space in England, and I just wonder if that's still there, if that's still allowed, because from the example in the Netherlands, where the Dutch railways, so in Dutch railways, and sometimes in front of them, they put the exact same types of screens that would sort of profile the passerby and show him or her a certain commercial. And they did this in secret, as it usually goes, but then of course someone found out and there was a big outcry, and the data protection officer, they clearly stated, indeed, it is processing of personal data, you need a special type of consent for this, and you just cannot do it like that, so they stopped. So I'm wondering what happened there in England.
And does it constitute personal data? That's the question. And in the UK, it seems like we've gone for no. And it was really interesting going to the Commission and talking to people like DG Connect, and they said no, it doesn't, because there's no images captured. That's the key bit, because normally when you think about a camera, you think in terms of images, but that's not the way it works. So because there's no images, there's no singling out in any way, shape, or form. It can't be tied to a code. It can't be tied to a device.
It's singling out. It singles out,
it's
not by name, but by gender, maybe, you know, by certain type of markers. So that is singling out. And according to European data protection law, which is so broad, I think, yes, quite clearly you can come to the answer that it is personal data.
Yeah, but we are where we are. And the technology is there. They've all consulted. They're kind of.
It's there.
So I'd like to see the case brought on this. I mean, as to whether it's singling, I don't know. I don't know, because in terms there's nothing anywhere that can be linked to a person. That's the difficulty. I'm not happy about it, I should add.
So I want to just say something about this, the lie detector. I checked who are the organizations that are involved in this. I think it's around 10 research institutions. And my guess would be that that's the data needed in order that science can progress in this specific area. Because in order that they validate their own hypothesis, they need data for this. And all the countries that are included, it is from the side of it's public institutions, it's public education. It's just like specific technology faculties that are involved in this. And it's also on the side, it's interesting that, I don't know why, but maybe not to be so easily scraped, but it's funny that you cannot really, you only see the logos of the organizations involved. So it's kind of like, again, science backing up that kind of oppression in a way. And for the GDPR facial recognition, every national state in EU can put additional legislation around this sensing of facial data. But we need to, one of the ideas of this festival should be that there is, I'm not sure what is the biggest problem that people think we should regulate more, or whether regulation is something that we are seeking. But Slovenia has the possibility to put additional additional legislation to further regulate this. So, yeah, that's a call for everyone who wants to contribute to this, so we can prevent this, because apparently it's not happening yet in Slovenia. But this is not 100%, but I asked, so I guess we can still do something. But the question is whether we need some public pressure and actually see whether people think this is problematic. I believe if people are giving a story, what this actually does, why is this important, people would understand that it's an issue. But if you just say that it's used for personalized services and to make user experience better, then we are users and we are consumers, we're not citizens. And like, I think this whole question should be phrased and framed in relation to us being citizens, not consumers. And then that's it.
Yeah, I agree. So GDPR itself is pretty clear that it says that, yes, there's X, Y, and Z legislation. You can't fall short of this, but you can do more. So each data protection region can do more if it wants to. So there's absolute scope to improve coverage, and particularly in relation, for example, in relation to these technologies. But I think, in terms of the user services thing, the interesting thing here, that argument can't be made. I know you're not making this argument, but there is no enhanced user experience. There is no enhanced user services. There's not really even the argument about personalized experience of advertising. It quite literally is just exploitation of citizen expressions. That's what it is. There is no benefit for people in any way, shape, or form.
Anyone else? So then I'm going to intervene. I agree with those who say that utopia shouldn't be a bad word or a dirty word. And we've talked mostly now about situations where emotional or empathetic technologies are being misused. What would be some of the ways in which you see that these can either enhance human experience, not just the user experience, which can maybe comment on what's happening? I'm sure there's a lot of stuff happening in art. So what are some of the examples which might hopefully someday go from art into our real lives to make things legitimately better?
Yeah, I mean, a few things there. One, I find a lot of technological discourse and commentary and philosophy, it tends towards the catastrophic, it tends towards the dystopian, and in all my work I try to avoid that. I don't like that narrative. I don't find it very helpful, because we do actually have issues and problems and things in front of us, and we need to deal with these things in quite tangible, realistic terms. So I don't start from the position that technology is innately bad. In terms of how these technologies can be used in interesting ways, they can. You know, they can enhance our interaction with our technology, and there are quite simple ways of doing that. So if we have the processing taking place on our devices, you know, edge computing, all that kind of stuff. So data isn't going to the cloud, but if it stays on our device, then you can interact with your technologies in new, novel, and kind of interesting ways. In terms of stuff from art itself, yeah, there are interesting things happening, you know, because we're talking about emotion, we're talking about expression, we're talking about self-discovery. I think for me, I'm working with a few artists in the UK on this stuff, and the project, I'm not sure if I should say this, but I will. The project that I really want to do, that I want to get this guy to do with me, is to explore the tension between these technologies that are based on categorizing basic emotions. Emotional life does not work that way. So I love the idea of kind of using these technologies to measure affect, to measure physiological experience, but for us to label those expressions ourselves. So to really kind of challenge this discourse that's growing around us, that emotions are simple. They're not. And I love the idea of kind of using kind of artistic expression, new modes of visualization, different modes of labeling, to kind of, to really kind of both explore our own emotions, but also to criticize the technologies.
But wouldn't you say here what's going to be a problem, or how should we approach this, that, for instance, a writer, somebody who writes novels professionally, is going to know dozens of words for different emotional states or experiences, whereas we don't even have the vocabulary to speak about these things properly, right? So most of us in this room are going to probably max out at 10 different words describing different expressions, yet in dictionaries there is over 30. Is there any way that affective computing can help us engage with ourselves in these terms, or is it because these things are going to be trapped in language, this is going to be forever our own concern?
Yeah, I think you have, I think people could do metaphor. I think people could say, it's like, it feels, I think people could do better. They kind of 8 or 10 expressions. But I do think there's an interesting question in terms of, these technologies are increasingly rolled out, whether they become the way that we think about emotions. So in terms of, will these technologies create a vernacular by which we understand our emotional life? I find that concerning, but I think from the artistic side of things, no, I think we can, we'll just have to try, won't we? Yeah.
Anyone else got any ideas? No? Okay, then I have another slightly dystopian thought experiment, in a way. When we talk about these technologies that basically measure our emotions, they datafy our emotions. They just become another data point in whatever network they're building, and we should think about them as parts of bigger constellations, right? So it's never just a machine that says this person is happy, but it's a machine that tries to make an inference out of that. It has to make a decision after the fact that it recognized this singular trait. And the problem then is still going to be what the end goal of this sort of algorithm is going to be. And there's this slightly depressive vision of Facebook actually killing people, right? So Facebook's algorithm in a way, wants to increase the amount of time we spend on Facebook, either because it wants to sell more ad space or because that's the obvious measure of how much you like the stuff that you see on Facebook. The more you enjoy it, like a gambler, incidentally, the more time you're going to spend there. So the algorithm is probably going to try to optimize around this. And it will probably spot at some point that a suicide event creates an uptick in Facebook's activity. So if someone commits the tragic act of suicide, the friends are going to come up there, there's going to be more activity, people are going to show more emotional input into the Facebook network itself. So this algorithm might slowly, among many other things that it does, start making the inference that a suicide event actually is a net positive effect on the whole network, right? Because there's much more activity at that point. And since we already know that Facebook has engaged in unethical experiments in manipulating people's emotions successfully, how do we even think about problems like these when we effectively get stuck in a scenario that a seemingly completely innocent optimization saying, I want people to spend more time on Facebook, can produce these effects? And there's actually anecdotal evidence of that. There's people reporting that during New Year's Eve and during December, so Christmas time and New Year's Eve, where people are more prone to commit suicide anyway, people get messages saying, you had 0 congratulations from your friends on your birthday this year, which to any human designer is an obvious edge case that you need to fix. Like, you would never allow a user to see nobody loves you. But the algorithm, apparently, which was left to decide who gets the notification and who doesn't, measured somehow that this is a good idea. How do we engage with fighting for our rights or our spaces or our intimacy in networks like these? Or if we just quit and burn the whole situation?
Yeah, well, I looked at slightly more broadly. We're kind of already there, and we have been arguably since the inception of journalism. So journalism has quickly tended, sorry, there's the journalists in the room, has quickly tended towards reporting the bad stuff. And they don't report it because they like reporting the bad stuff. They report it because, unfortunately, people perversely seem to like reading the bad stuff. So that's why we don't have kind of newspapers full of good news. So in terms of kind of your question, and I guess in a sense that is kind of a relatively simple algorithm. It's very straightforward, but I guess the principle kind of still applies online. And I guess what you've done, you've kind of taken it to a conclusion. So in terms of your broader point, I guess the question then is kind of how do you kind of mitigate for kind of negative loop algorithms?
Or even algorithms which are going to unintentionally produce negative effects. So I'm sure this algorithm is going to infer many, many interesting things about people and it's going to show cats to people who love cats and all sorts of trivial stuff. But in the end, there are going to be, if not direct, very, very close to direct effects of these algorithms which are going to be negative. Is there a way for us to fight against these things? Because, for instance, even when Facebook replaced the like button with all of the different emotions that you can now choose, this basically led to them creating a much more detailed psychological profile of the people who are on that network. So even the interface is changing in that way. Do we have to stop participating in those things? Are there ways in which we can think about protesting against this, saying that we don't want this happening? Are there any options, or do we have to start hiding our emotions?
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear if people have a good answer in the room. I don't have I don't use Facebook. I got rid of my Facebook account a long time ago, and Philip, I know you don't either.
Join us.
Yeah, I know the reason why I left Facebook is because it didn't make me that happy. It made me sadder rather than happy, so I got rid of it. I don't have an answer to that, unfortunately.
Any ideas in the room? Or any distracting thoughts to take us away from this? No? All right, but I guess we can switch away from the suicide pact with Facebook to going back to advertising again. what we've seen with programmatic advertising, at least in Slovenia, in my experience, in my few advertising years, is that it is mostly underutilized. So advertising agencies don't do as much with it as they possibly could, because they don't have as much interest in actually utilizing these things. When you're an ad agency, effectively, you just want to get paid and move on, especially if you're just an employee. However, these tools, once they are created for advertisers, get misused by other groups with differing interests or with stronger interests. So political parties, fringe groups who want to achieve something, activists or NGOs who want to do things. Is it a problem, or how to think about the fact that what we're left with, even when we try to do good with these tools, are tools that were effectively designed for mass manipulation in a very specific advertising sense? And how do we start or go about building tools, or what would these types of tools even look like if they weren't primarily advertising, but would be designed for social change that we can get behind it?
So is your idea to use programmatic technologies for positive social change?
So, for instance, or you could even argue that you cannot use programmatic advertising for positive social change, and that the problem is that somebody even came up with programmatic advertising and not discourse intensifying advertising or having clear thoughts, TM advertising. Are there ways in which we can think about affective computing or the information that we now get about people's emotional states to help us in these ways?
I don't know if the solutions are necessarily technological, but I think it's interesting when programmatic advertising, the idea of programmatic advertising is that it takes data points from a range of sources. So behavioral advertising collects uses cookies and collects tracks your behavior as you move around the web. Programmatic advertising collects data from different devices and applications as well, not just web-based technologies. So it builds a much more complete and richer picture of who and what you are. But I think it's interesting to see the Adland's reactions to these technologies. WPP is one of the biggest ad spenders, by far one of the biggest advertising spenders in the world. They've pulled out of programmatic. They've said this is not good for our brands. Our brands are getting placed on next to terrorist YouTube videos. We really don't like this stuff. Our brands aren't happy, so they're pulling out. And it's interesting talking to people within the advertising industry itself. Creative departments hate this stuff. So from the point of view, what brands in an ideal world are trying to build good relationship. They're trying to make decent products and have a relationship with customers, and thereafter win more custom. And we could debate the health and merits of advertising, but I think in terms of I think the creative dimension of advertising is something that supports our cause. I think it's actually quite supportive of. It's perverse, but it does support our objectives and goals, which is less privacy invasive technological environments.
So you'd say that creative directors and advertising agencies are allies more than they are
Do you know,
enemies?
you may have heard of the Open Rights Group. Open Rights Group is a UK-based NGO, data protection NGO. We had an event there. We brought creative director MNC Saatchi along, who are ironically responsible for the Oxford Street ad.
Anyone, anything? Yes, no? I can keep on going, but I'm not sure if I can read your minds as to what you want to talk about. Yes, no? Nothing. Okay. So I have another theme that I'd like to challenge you on, and you've mentioned it in your presentation, and it's the question of dignity, right, which necessarily affects our bodies. And the question here, I guess, is twofold. One, the obvious perspective is how these technologies are spying on our bodies. What does it mean to bring our bodies out into the street, and what happens with them, and how we actually use them to achieve things. But on the other hand, should we be talking about virtual bodies that need to be protected in a way, right? So the fact that all of this stuff that is gathered about me, my own being, my actions inhabiting this planet, are lumped together in sort of a virtual entity which is currently distributed between many providers. Everyone holds a little chunk of who the virtual me is. But should we start thinking about rights based on that? Should we allow people to make their digital or virtual bodies whole, or should we allow them to have the same protections for their virtual bodies as they have for their real bodies, right? So nobody can ever force me to take off my pants, not even the police officer, but no limit like this exists for our virtual selves. Is this something that we can start managing in any meaningful way?
I can see why one might try to make a parallel between kind of the virtual and the physical, and of course you could quite very easily argue that the kind of the physical, the virtual impacts on the physical as well. But I think, you know, when it comes down to daily experience of these technologies, of what's on the horizon line, the idea that I can walk into a retail outlet and that I'll have cameras, not just kind of monitoring whether I'm kind of smiling or whether I'm happy, but measuring the blood flow under my face to look at my reactions to products. I find that much more intrusive than my identity, you know, or kind of traces of my identity kind of being in kind of Google servers, Facebook servers, et cetera, et cetera. While I'm not particularly happy on that, and I try to take steps to have the appropriate boundaries, what I'm comfortable with in terms of what I'm willing to share, what I'm not willing to share online, yeah, I find the physical stuff is just quite literally kind of visceral for me.
Any idea why? Apart from it being a visceral reaction, what makes this, I don't know, intervention into your own physical body so different? Because it's very passive, right? Just, I can look at you right now. I could be very aware of how red your face is at which point. But why is this such a difference once this becomes automated?
Yeah, I'd be interested to know what the room thinks about this. But for me, yeah, I have kind of a gut-based reaction. And it's, yeah, in terms of, you just can't be more personal. In terms of understanding, mapping, and remembering each physiological gesture, movement, expression happening, that's me. So in terms of when it kind of comes to questions of kind of online stuff, yeah, I guess maybe, but yeah, the idea that we can make an equivalence between fragmentary inferences based upon kind of what kind of websites I look at, whether I'm based on cycling websites or even whether it be health-based websites, wherever it might be. But yeah, the idea of kind of moving through an entirely surveyed space, in real space, not just online space, but physical space that belongs to citizens. You know, many of us live in democracies. The idea is that this space is ours. So for commercial companies to come in there and try and appropriate, commodify bodies as they move through urban spaces, I'm not on board with that. And I find it difficult to make an equivalence with kind of online tracking.
But does that mean that what we have to start fighting for are public spaces that belong to us? Because today we have a variety of different public spaces, right? So technically this is a public place, except it's private. Mm-hmm. And then there's the square in front of the house, which is a public place. And then you have the other type of private public spaces, which are shopping malls, where things like this are going to go through much faster than basically on the square here in front of us. So do we need to rethink the spaces that we inhabit in order to fight this effectively, or in order to...
I think, you know, this kind of speaks to Nika's point in terms of what do we do as kind of a result of this discussion. And so this is something that I was at an event at the United Nations speaking on precisely this point in terms of the need to protect and be aware of public spaces. But you're right, we live in a world occupied where there's many spaces which are quasi-public spaces. So yes, a retail space is not owned by me. Somebody has bought rights to use that space in many ways that they see fit, not every way, but in ways that they see fit. Yeah, that's that is really problematic. But data protection laws do apply. As this stuff becomes more granular, there are strong provisions here, and it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see kind of how shops try and get our consent on this kind of stuff.
last call for questions, thoughts, challenges. Yes, no? Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I like this. I like your slides. I mean, we all know that advertising is a form of terrorism and of, making people think what they don't think in the first place, and trying to influence people. So why even try to exculpate advertising industry as if they were well-intentioned? I think this is a wrong premise. You should start with this premise, like this is about talking dirty and influencing people into making choices that they wouldn't normally do, right? So with this thing, what I expect, if I may speculate a tiny little bit, what will be happening is just like with all the rest of technology, we slowly normalize it, we get used to it, and just like you said, oh, I don't want this machine to steal my soul, this, reminds me of history of photography, right? And then the soul wasn't exactly taken away from those people that were photographed, in the same way that, unfortunately, not you personally, because you're like me, you're like a pre-digital senior citizen. We're all just waiting to die, really. But the others, the kids, are born into this as in the only world that they know, and for them this is like super normal, and that's how it's going to work. Electricity, an interesting thing, didn't exist before, and before it existed, people would go to sleep with hens, with chicken, as they say. People had their circadian rhythms attuned with nature, and now we don't. Look at us sitting here in the artificial light, and 120 or 30 years ago, it would be a scandal. Like, how dare you interfere with a very natural order of things? But for us, it's like the super most normal thing in the world. And that, I believe, is the roller coaster we're all on.
Yeah, I guess two things. Is advertising terrorism? This event was advertised? Yeah, okay. So I don't buy the... I think the basic premise of advertising, I don't have a huge amount of problem with. In terms of kind of notification, if I've made a new type of laptop, if I've made... I don't have a problem with advertising per se. But to come back to the second point, which is kind of perhaps the more important one, is will young people get into this? Is it the boiling frog situation where, because they kind of grown up in a kind of a digital life generation, that they kind of used to being surveyed? In terms of the research that I did for this project, younger people were slightly more accepting, on the basis that they weren't identified, but they were vehemently against the idea of being identified. So what that tells me is that this was across not just advertising, this was across a whole, so I just kind of looked at in gaming, for example, in terms of social media, and kind of a bunch of different types of technologies, and a bunch of different use areas. Yeah, younger people were slightly more accepting it, but they hated the idea of having kind of inferences about their emotions connected with personal data. I think that kind of affect them in some way, shape, or form. But what that tells me then is that it's not necessarily a boiling frog situation, but rather young people are kind of okay with kind of new modes of interactivity, for example, in gaming, but they want control over the process. That was kind of what came through loud and clear. So I don't necessarily kind of follow the kind of dystopian line that there's kind of a boiling frog and the kind of young people, progressive generations coming through increasingly want or kind of are used to more surveillance. It doesn't seem that way to me. So I think there's some cause for optimism there somewhere.
If there are no other thoughts that want to be exposed, then I'm going to give you all a cigarette break and the artists their time to get ready. And I'd like you to thank Professor McStay once again, and then we're off to the cold or to the snacks thing. Thank you.